Just a quick message before we begin. If you've been thinking about joining the BAST Level 5 Singing Teacher Qualification this September 2024, then this is your reminder to get your applications in before the closing date in a couple of weeks on the 5th of August. And remember, if you have completed the 20-hour course with us before, then this is the last term that you can get all those fees deducted from the cost of the qualification. So to find out more, head over to basttraining.com. On with the podcast.
Throughout my bookwormery, circa 1989, I've sought out mainly fiction, and I have vivid memories of the stories which made me decide to take the slow train to London just for a few extra minutes to read it, or the ones which made me sob dramatically into a towel. Thank you very much, Hanya Yanagihara. But when you pick up a book by the, let's face it, vocal marvels, who are Ingo Tietze and Karin Titze-Cox, you know you're entering academic territory. Not so long ago, Kate Cubley paid a visit to the podcast, and we talked about how academic journals and research papers can just sometimes be avoided because they feel a bit too difficult to read. There are no real characters to speak of. The language is often complex, and there are no poetic descriptions or worlds created that we can escape into. So when I got my hands on a copy of Voices Free after SOVT, I was quite nervous. The book was written as an introduction to the science and application of SOVT, and it's a celebration of the minds who have come together across the years to explore and inform on this topic. The book is aimed at anyone, really, but particularly those who are curious about why SOVTs are vocally effective and what they physically offer. The book is split into 4 main chapters and has an appendix, and it includes a history of SOVT, an in-depth exploration of the science behind SOVTs and the application of them in clinics and studios, as well as an account from Karin Titze-Cox herself describing her clinical philosophy. Is it sciencey? Yes, and if you have a taste for theory and physics, then you'll likely be rather satisfied, I'd imagine. For others, there are some elements that may be challenging to understand, and for me and my science anxiety, there are some equations, references, and graphics that my brain just simply repels at this stage. Overall, it was important for the authors, Ingo and Karin, that the scientific terminology was correct, but they also wanted to ensure that the audience could follow and not be alienated in the process. So they offer helpful analogy and repetition as ways to explain and reiterate a particular complex point. Some of the challenging parts have become easier to understand for me the more I've revisited them, as well as seeking out other ways to have it explained. Thankfully, the book includes links to videos to assist us, and you can find some of these in the show notes. And Ingo Tietze gave a very clear presentation for Chris Johnson's Evolve community on this topic and clarified some of the information which I personally found difficult to read. But is it helpful? Also, yes. I've read this book almost 3 times since I first got it, and it's helped me in solidifying my understanding of the benefits of SOVT. I found myself taking some really useful notes, and have come away with more confidence in the application of SOVT in singing training. It might just need a few attempts to fully get to grips with all the content, and sometimes that's just learning for you. Without further ado, it's with pure delight to introduce Ingo Tietze and Karin Titze-Cox to the podcast. And what great company we get to keep for the next hour, eh? Ingo and Karin, it is the biggest pleasure to welcome you to the Singing Teachers Talk podcast. How are you both?
Great.
Very well. Very good.
Yeah. Karin, in your conversation with John Henney on his Intelligent Vocalist podcast, you mentioned how you spent a lot of time in the family kitchen talking about voice and SOVTs and research. And you also mentioned in your book how the conversation about SOVTs blew up after a question was posted on Michael Carnell's Listery for voice professionals, I think it was. Now, the conversation around my family dinner table is often not suitable for air, but could you give us an insight to what those conversations were like around the table that you might be sitting at now, and what you remember that question being that you saw on the Listery?
Yeah, that that question, it was way back in like 2010, I think. And it was a really unique time because Ingo had just moved from the Denver Center to Salt Lake City. And so we got to see each other a lot more and discuss different concepts. And it seemed like every time we were getting together as a family, we'd start getting really interested in talking about the big picture of voice and what scientific concepts made sense to me and what clinical concepts made sense to him. And we just kept talking, and our family would kind of give us the eye roll, like, oh, there they go again. And then they go and do something else. We just kept going. But it was a really unique time. And during that time, there was a question posted on the listserv from a speech pathologist, I think, I think it was professor in Arizona, who wondered about something that she had read from Ingo about the abduction of the vocal folds. And she was trying to understand clinically what that meant. Like, does that mean that, if I've got someone who is already abducted and has a posterior glottal chink, why would SOVT benefit that person? So then people were chiming in and saying, well, I think he meant this, and I think he meant, different things. And then finally I said, well, I'll just ask him. And so then he gave me his answers, and I posted it, and it just enlightened, I think, a lot of folks. And then that started a conference on SOVTs, and that was a really successful conference that Eric Hunter organized with the National Center of Voice and Speech.
I should say, though, that our kitchen talk started much earlier than that. When we were both in Iowa, Karin was getting her master's degree in speech language pathology, and she actually took one of my classes that I taught. And she sat in the first row, and we had to be very careful that we were not appearing to be too close to each other. When one was a student, the other was a professor. And so we had to have our conversations around the table a lot.
Yeah. And Ingo, I love my dad, but I just couldn't imagine having a project like this with him, writing a book with him. I could imagine it being sprawled with red pen, like it used to be on my homework, bless him. But what was it like collaborating with your daughter, and what do you think she would say it was like writing a book with you?
Well, we come from two different perspectives. For me, it was always, is the language scientifically correct? And do we not repeat ourselves too often with what we say? Karin, on the other hand, works with people all day long, and sometimes repetition is good, saying it another way with slightly different words and so forth. So I was always cutting out things, saying, we've already said that. And she said, no, this is in the context right now that we need to say this again. And this is where our differences, I think, came in. And it's particularly noticed in the appendix versus the chapters before that, because we do want to talk to more than one group of people.
Yeah, the appendix is more of a clinically based concept, and the other chapters are more scientific with a lot of some equations, not a lot, but I would read through and I would say something like, you lost me. I don't know where we are here. Can you give me an example? And he would look at my clinical explanations as, you lost me here. That term isn't exactly correct. And so it was really, actually, it was kind of fun because we wanted to get it right. We wanted the audience, we care enough about our audience that we wanted to make sure that they understood in more plain language, but we wanted to make sure that their terminology was right, or our terminology was right, and what they were learning from the book, they could count on.
Yeah. And who is the book actually aimed at?
Anyone. Honestly, I mean, I think clinicians, teachers, students, anyone who is interested in the why of what voice is all about. I mean, scientists, there's enough for everyone in the book.
And we should say that the detail of the science is also reported in official peer-reviewed journals, and that was done ahead of time. Particularly, some of what we write in chapters 2 and 3 comes from an article that we published in Computational Biology, which is a fairly high-ranking journal and reaches a lot of people. And there we had multiple authors, not just the two of us, but we engaged other people who contributed to that.
It was really fascinating because as we were writing, we'd be like, oh, we need to answer this question. And so, well, let's develop a study for that one. And so a lot of this was a process of over, well, about 5 years of talking about and really nailing down what we wanted to impart to our audience. So,
and how was the writing process? Would you write pages and then send them over to Ingo and vice versa, and it was done over email, or was that again at the kitchen table?
We decided chapter 1 we would write together. Chapters 2 and 3 I mainly wrote, and then she made comments about, how well can I understand it. And then chapters after that were again more together. We wrote paragraphs each. And the appendix is really all Karin's, basically.
But I really needed his input on that too. So yeah, it was collaborative.
And there's a really huge bibliography. It could be a book in itself. You've accumulated, I think, over about 310 references of all these minds who have come together to contribute to this work on SOVT. If a teacher is stuck on where to start with really digesting this information and going deep, other than your book, have you got a reference that you think would be a really great place to start?
Well, we know at least 2 authors to whom we've given a lot of credit in the front, and we showed their pictures. So right now, reading what Marco Guzman has written and what Maria Laukanen have written would be a great start for anybody.
Yeah, great. Well, let's go into a bit of the nitty-gritty on SOVTs then. So, Karin, can you define what you think the overarching objectives are for SOVTs?
Oh, well, there are a number of objectives in the book, but a lot of it, I think there were 7 objectives, but most of it is what does the SOV do for the posturing of the vocal folds, posturing of the vocal tract? Why can you also go to extremes with these postures? And why that benefits you, why it's important also to get the right matching of impedance, and how to transfer the power so that it is the most efficient.
We wanted to show that SOVT is not something you do with a lot of cognitive involvement, where you have to think a lot. And we contrast that with techniques like the Lesak-Maxon resonance voice therapy, where you kind of think about how you vocalize and how you phonate when you speech. We wanted to have something that you can do while you're driving the car, while you're washing dishes, while you're mowing the lawn, whatever. You can always do your exercises without having to think about it, because so much of it adjusts itself passively, without the brain being involved inside. And that's the beauty of SOVT. It's basically something that sets the body in a condition simply by doing it. You don't have to think about it.
Yeah.
And that's beautiful. I mean, the example we use is like if you were learning a skill, like say basketball, where you need to shoot a ball into a hoop. The SOVT allows you to posture everything so efficiently so that you're hitting the target. And all you really have to do is then play and shoot the ball all over the court, and shoot the ball when someone's in your face, or shoot the ball when, it's a different court or a different environment. So if you get lots of that variable practice, then you can get a motor memory or a muscle memory that allows you to depend on that. So you don't in the game have to think about everything you're doing, or when you're singing, you can think about the message instead of thinking about all the muscles that created that efficiency. Another thing is that the hard part of this, honestly, and where there's a lot of clinical application, is then how does someone have that muscle memory and then learn? And so a lot of the learning happens in the rest time where you go back to it and it's a novel situation. And it's not, it's not all about the practice, although we need a lot of practice, but the learning is just as important.
Yeah. I remember we were speaking to Dr. Molly Gebrian on the topic of the science of learning and the cognition and practice and how we set up practice. And she's a violist, and she was talking about having a very focused intention to the practice and then actually taking the break to help that learning set in. So if we do start to give a deep focus to the SOVT, could that have an opposite effect? Could it actually hinder us in a way if we start to give it a deep focus?
Well, I had a person that came and wanted to study with me. He came from Mexico, and he was so enamored with SOVT. He was doing it all day long, and he was walking the streets doing SOVT exercises, and every time he got in the car, he was doing them. And we recommend that we do it for a short period of time, maybe 5 minutes, 10 minutes at a time, and then leave the thing alone and do something else. Because as you just said, the processing and the deep learning in your brain comes during time when you're actually not, riveted on it. They say that you learn how to play tennis in the winter and how to ski in the summer, because you need that time where the brain is by itself, processing all these things that have been put into the muscle memory, as Karin says.
Oh, and in my experience, some singers that come in and are trying to change the posture of their voice for whatever reason, so that they can get more efficiency. If they practice the SOVT, they will get an immediate result from that, typically, if they don't resist that change. And that's really the hard thing, is because we've learned over many decades how to sing, and we are so in tune as singers that doing a change is sometimes difficult. So in that process, we say, get out of what you already know and let the resistance, let the posturing work for you, and then try to pay attention, right, and focus to that change. And that's where the learning happens.
Yeah. Your book has got quite a few really interesting graphics, and there's some which I need to go back to and digest a little bit more. And in fact, some I might probably sprout wings and a unicorn horn before I really get it. But one of the graphics I found really interesting is the different intraoral pressures that you've lined up, determined by the different SOVTs. So moving from the hum, the all the way up to a straw in water, and seeing how the pressures that build up differ between them in men and women. Can you tell us, Ingo, what's actually physically happening when an intraoral pressure increases from that hum, that M, to the straw in water?
Yeah, several things happen. First of all, that intraoral pressure widens the entire airway. From Pascal's law of physics, we know that whenever you have a nearly enclosed volume of air, anytime you change the pressure somewhere, it'll quickly adjust and go to all parts of that volume. So by creating a pressure behind the lips, we immediately create a pressure all the way down to the glottis. And so we get an expansion, and an expansion is good because when we create variety of vowels and consonants and variety of sound qualities, we create those by making part of the vocal tract wide and part of it narrow. For example, when we make an ah vowel, we make the front of the vocal tract wide and the back narrow. We make an e vowel, we make the back wide and the front narrow. And so we need that variation of lots of different shapes. And if we begin with a wide shape to begin with, then we have the chance to make all these other corrections easier. And in particular, it also widens the top of the glottis. The glottis is the space between the vocal folds. And that then gives you a better chance of squaring up the vocal folds and the edges of them so that they're more parallel instead of in some other shape. And those are all benefits that come automatically when you produce that pressure. And the reason we wanted to choose all of those variations with semi-occlusions is to give people an idea how much more pressure do you get from one semi-occlusion versus another. And do you want that much pressure or not? And Karin mentioned before that this is dependent on where the client is and how much of that pressure they need to make their correction.
Yeah, so on that, how do we help the singer or the patient to find their optimum SOVT for a specific task or whatever they might be going through?
You want to make sure that they can do that SOVT with a full range from the extremes of high and low and loud and soft. You want to make sure that it's comfortable for them, that they're moving when they're doing the task, so that they aren't, resisting muscularly to what's happening there. And sometimes a real narrow straw can be a little too much for someone the first time they do it. It is always good to get to more narrow straws or more resistance, because that's going to be a very quick change if they can get there. But you may need to start with something less narrow, less resistance, the opening is a little bit wider, or use several different openings, or you can use multiple straws to measure it, the resistance. The important thing is that whatever device you use, you need to know what that resistance is. And that's why that chart is very helpful, so that you can make decisions on where a patient is or a client is, so that you can move to smaller resistances or smaller openings. And so greater resistances, smaller openings. And then once they start to really have that, then you can start using articulation and things that aren't as resistive. But at that point, they know that they can modify their pharynx and their vocal folds to an optimal position.
And do SOVTs all kind of behave in the same way? I know that they've got different intraoral pressures, but does that then mean that the hum is not as efficient as something with a higher pressure, or does it just mean they're working slightly differently?
Well, all the effects that we have quantified suggest that there is a direct relationship between the amount of oral pressure you produce and the advantage you get in the glottis as well as the rest of the vocal tract. So we have not found a direction in which to go where you lose something with it, where you diminish the voice efficiency. All the way through, we find that what is important to transfer the acoustic power from the source out to the lips and then to the listener is to balance the resistances that exist between the source and the vocal tract. And always we find that the glottal resistance is usually too high, And so you want to go in the direction of minimizing that resistance and then producing some resistance above the glottis that matches that. We call that the maximum power transfer. That's well known in all communication theory. Whenever you want to take a signal and you transfer it from one place to another, you have to match the impedances or resistances. And that's what we're doing basically by using that intraoral pressure.
Yeah.
Now, there could be a situation where you have so much pressure that you're driving the vocal folds too far apart, and then you get into the negative benefit. I don't know who has reported that. In all the work we've done, we have not seen that.
Yeah.
That would be, I think, if someone is pushing way too hard to make something happen and they aren't as flexible with the tissues and the muscles. So, but if they're willing to let the reposturing happen, I think it can't really hurt you.
Yeah.
Honestly.
Yeah.
Yeah, there is the issue though of if you've got a wider type of leaking of air or glottis,
Very breathy voice.
very breathy voice. A lot of folks will not be able to produce a sound with a very narrow straw, and so going to a wider and then graduating to a narrow is very helpful for them. And diagnostic. And they start to realize that, oh yeah, I am getting better closure. Or if they have a lesion and there's some stiffness of the vocal folds, if that pliability comes back, they start noticing that, yeah, they're able to graduate to smaller straws or greater resistances.
And so you've talked about the posturing of the vocal folds, the squaring up of them. Does that still happen in something with a smaller intraoral pressure like the hum? Are you still getting those same effects?
Again, you do get a certain amount of pressure in the diagram that you're referring to. A hum might create 1 or 2, maybe 3 centimeters of water, equivalent pressure. And that's often enough to get some reposturing of the vocal folds.
And especially when you're in the context of speech, a hum can be very, very effective to help the muscles remember, oh, that's what I'm supposed to do.
And that is a very important point that she's pointing out right now, is because when we're in running speech, we can't keep putting a straw in our mouth. And so we have to use whatever mechanism we have naturally to produce a semi-occlusion. And fricatives, voice fricatives, the z and the zh and the v and hums are all part of speech. And so when you play through those to get you to the vowel, then you have the benefit right while you're doing it.
Yeah. And how long does that effect of the SOVT last once you've stopped doing it? And is it the case of doing the whole break and having a gap for the brain to learn it? Is that the way that it stays?
We have just done a study on that. It's coming out in the Journal of Speech and Hearing Research, where we compared a protocol given for flow-resistant tubes or the straw versus the Lesak-Madsen Kitty-Verlini approach. And we found that the effect lasts pretty well. If they do a little bit every day of the exercises, then after 4 weeks, it is very well embedded into the motor planning of the individual, and oftentimes then lasts another several months thereafter without doing much of anything. But will it last forever, and will you never have to come back to it? That's a bigger question.
It's such a dynamic instrument, so you have to also keep in mind that if any marathon runner who's really using their body and a lot of demand and the stakes are high and there are great extremes in the body, they do need to kind of stretch and reset and let their body heal and go back to less contraction and more stretching of tissue. So the same can be said for those that their demand is really high. They may need to go back and use their semi-occlusions again. And also you have effects of aging. You have, a number of hormonal effects. So the instrument may need a little bit of resetting once in a while. But I think the goal is to get to the point where you don't need to use this straw all day, that you get the muscle memory and you have the learning, so that the patient or the client is more independent.
I'm just pressing the pause button on the podcast for a very brief moment to invite you to book your free BAST call. If you've been thinking about joining the BAST community through one of our courses, but you just don't know which option is the best for you, then why not book your free Zoom chat with our very own Kimberly George, who has all the answers. Head over to basttraining.com/book-a-call/ and click that big blue button. That's basttraining.com/book-a-call/. Now, where were we?
Karin, in clinic, how do you utilize SOVT, and is there a particular one that certain voice disorders react to better compared to other voice disorders?
Yeah, well, we use it to evaluate first. We use the SOVTs to see where the limitations of their voice is. Sometimes it's a matter of conditioning. And so using the straw and water where you can see flow and you know that someone is using good abdominal breathing and they're supporting their sound, that can be very helpful. There are situations where we really need to, like the posturing of the vocal folds fine, but in different contexts of speech, they kind of get out of it and out of that efficiency. So then we may use like a cup that is over the mouth and have them do the SOVT in the context of speech and to see where those limitations are. So it really is very dynamic in my mind. I don't have one particular SOVT or one particular protocol. I really want to find what the limitations are and see what we can do with a number of different SOVTs and programs that are out there already. I use Lesak Madsen voice or resonant voice therapy. I use vocal function exercises, especially if we need to increase more adduction in the context of speech. We really want to use some of those concepts of kind of getting back on the treadmill and getting the patient conditioned for that. So it really does depend on the needs of the patient.
Right. And Ingo, we've come across lots of different things that tell us when we're using the straw in water, if we get splashed and we spend the day soaked, it means that we have pushed too much air. And then some people say, oh no, that's actually not correct. Could you clear that up for us? What does it mean when we are going around dripping for the rest of the day?
Well, first of all, immersing a straw or any kind of a tube into water will immediately add additional oral pressure. And it's very simple because whatever depth you immerse it in will be exactly how much centimeters of water pressure will be added behind the lips. So, but the second benefit is that you see actually flow occurring. And Karin always says that some of her clients like the fact that they get a feel for how much flow is coming through the system as well, because we don't see the pressures, but we do see bubbles. Yeah. And so every time that we have some kind of a visualization of something that's going on, then that helps. And especially kids love it, of course, because they would do it for voice or something else.
It's also great to mask the sound. Sometimes we're so in tune with our what we hear, that we try to make the sound happen, where as the bubbles kind of mask that, and it's not about the sound that you're hearing when you're doing the semi-occlusion, it's the after, right? That we notice the difference, but during it, we don't want anything else in the way. Even our own perceptions of our sound can sometimes get in the way. So the masking is helpful.
There are recent studies that, and again, Guzman is very much into that. Is there actually a massage effect that you get from the bubbles? Because the bubbles do create a little bit of vibration on the straw or whatever you have, and that works its way into the oral cavity, and then the cheeks are massaged a little bit. How much of that will get down to the larynx actually for a laryngeal massage? That's still a question.
Okay.
But we do know that almost in every tissue in the body, some amount of movement is helpful to keep the cells active and to heal and to produce new cell and new material. So every recovery from injury, for example, now suggests that there should be some kind of movement, and vibration is a good movement.
I had this very question about stuff splashing in the face, because I did have a client that I was so excited to share the straw and water, and the first thing that happened was he had a bath, basically. It went everywhere. And so I really worked hard, and this stimulated a little bit of, we have a video link, I think, stimulated some of our thoughts about depth of water and what kind of pressures are needed in speech and for duration and singing and loudness. And what I did was I basically, here, I'll show you. I found a water bottle that would give me enough space and be tapered so that the bubbles don't splash in their face. And we put 2 straws together and just taped them so that it would stay enough away from the face, and you would still get the benefit of hearing or feeling the bubbles, but you can look up and have a natural position instead of looking over your cup and having it splash all over you.
Yeah. And does it matter what we're putting in the water? I've got the little coffee stirrers or cocktail straws here. I've also got a thicker vocal tube.
Yeah.
So does it matter what we put in the water, or can you use anything, any size?
The deeper you go into the water, the less the tube or the straw makes a difference. Because if you're immersing it 10, 15 centimeters deep, as Karin sometimes does, then most of the pressure is dependent on that depth. And whether you use a thin straw or a thick one doesn't matter so much anymore. But if you only immerse it at maybe 2 or 3 centimeters, then a lot of resistance will still come from the tube or the straw.
The length and the narrowness, yeah.
Okay, yeah. And what about the material? I think you mentioned in your book about the material of the straw. Does that matter, or do paper ones from McDonald's do?
We have put the appropriate pressures on what would be glass or would be metal or would be plastic, and you don't get any expansion in the tubes. And so therefore, the material doesn't really matter much. That's our first conclusion.
It would matter maybe to the patient or the client if it's convenient for them to have a tube that they can wash and keep around them all the time, and it's sterile, that's fine. You know, it really depends on the convenience of the client, what they like, and what's available for them.
Yeah. When you're working with a singer who you're applying an SOVT to, and they don't seem to be able to carry a chest voice, an M1, particularly high, maybe they're cracking out before the expected pitch area, what might that say about the musculature, the instrument, or the SOVT itself?
Well, the minute you semi-occlude your vocal tract, all of your resonances move downward. Normally, you have your first resonance of the vocal tract around 500 hertz. the second one around 1500 hertz. But the minute that you semi-occlude, that first resonance will go down to about 200 hertz. That means that as you're gliding through and singing songs now through that, or whatever vocalization you do, you're going to find that your voice trips up because you're not used to those resonances being in a different place. I had a bass baritone come to me and said, I've used your straw, and for the first time, I felt my voice cracking. And I asked him, what's your highest note that you've ever sung on stage or wherever? He says, I go to about an E. And I said, well, you've always been below the first resonance with everything you've done. And now you're bringing that resonance down, and you're beginning to feel what sopranos and tenors and everybody else struggles with all the time.
Right.
And so we give them a completely different feel for where the resonances are. And that's a good thing, because then they work through those, and wherever they occur, they're able to work around them.
Okay.
It actually forces a lot of the posturing of the vocal folds to be in the middle. And also it allows for the more mixed or middle voice too. So we like that because, of course, that's a very healthy kind of positioning. But we don't mind going to the extremes and, pushing the limits of that. But we like to kind of live in the middle, or at least be able to negotiate in the middle, especially as clients and patients start to age. Sometimes even our belters, they're just not able to get to that high belt that they were when they were younger. So we want to give them strategies from a middle voice to modify the vowel and kind of allow them to cheat a little bit, so there is more longevity in their voice.
I'm glad you mentioned the term M1, standing for mechanism 1. I hope not mode 1, because some people are now using the word mode, and that's not the best way to go. But mechanism 1, we believe that there is a gradual transmission between mechanism 1 and 2, that you can have mechanism 1.2, 1.4, 1.7, or whatever you want, which is a mixing basically of the amount of tension that you have in the thyroid muscle as opposed to the ligament. So there's a gradual transition from one layer of the vocal fold to another with these mechanisms. And SOVT helps you to be in that middle, as Karin says, that mixture between the ligament movement, dictating the frequency, and the thyroid muscle.
In the chapter on approaches for implementation, Karin, you say when higher resistances are questioned, a phrase comes to mind: don't resist resistance. It's what allows change. So how do you help your clients to be okay with this sense of back pressure?
Yeah, I mean, sometimes it's really difficult. Like we were just talking, you'll have someone come in and say, I've never felt this before. This feels strange. This feels different. I don't have, what the range I had, or I have now new brakes that I didn't have before. But my answer to that is, well, that's kind of the point. If you came to see me to improve your voice, we're going to need some change. And sometimes it is going through this exploration of how much your tissue can expand. If it's always been, especially parts of the pharynx, kind of narrow, and it hasn't had an opportunity to expand, we want to try it out and see if we can improve the ratios between the top of the vocal fold to, this laryngeal canal to the pharynx, and see if we can maximize that for them. So yeah, they're going to feel different. They're going to feel change. And that's the point. Resistance allows for change.
At the risk of name dropping again, I have to say that Renee Fleming is more interested in using a lot of resistance in inhalation than even an exhalation. She uses a straw or whatever tube constantly when she wants to get a deep breath. The inhalation, because she says that's when my rib cage really expands, and I use the musculature for expanding the rib cage and train it really to get that quick and very large breath increase with the rib cage. So that's, again, don't resist resistance, because it's exactly what helps you, strengthen the muscles.
Yeah. And that's a great understanding to know that it's not just an exhalation thing. We can use SOVTs for an inhalatory practice as well.
And another point is that it's not just it allows for strengthening muscles, but it allows for releasing of muscles. Sometimes we contract muscles we shouldn't, or we have some resistance in the tissues. And so it's just as important to relax muscles as it is to activate or contract them for this posturing.
And that's something that I wanted to ask actually about the posturing behind the SOVT. I know you've mentioned movement, and you can move the tongue up and down, and you can kind of make sure there's no holding patterns being brought in. But when we're using a straw or whatever, a lip trill, what do we want to encourage as the posture behind that, in terms of trying to make sure that the throat isn't constricting against it, or the tongue isn't, misbehaving? What would you say there?
I'm going to let him take these. He did this study where there were different postures in simulation behind the straw. And he noticed different things that happen, different resonance changes that might be more beneficial for someone that is going for more of a belt kind of configuration, as opposed to a more mixed voice with a more classical style. But it also depends on what you do, what you're going to be comfortable with. Like if you are more of a belt kind of singer, then perhaps you're going to migrate to a tongue position that is more of an ah, right? Back there. And if you're more of a mixed voice, maybe a more e. But it depends on where you are and your range too, what is most beneficial for you. So it brings us to the point of, once we get a good configuration of the vocal tract, in the back portion of the vocal tract, what can we then do to maximize in the front portion?
Yeah.
I do my straw exercise with as much movement as I can. I move my head side to side, and I move my tongue forward and back. And I try to do every kind of movement to relax myself, so that I can say, I can do this glide now in any position you want me to be in. And but I have to say this, that we studied the amount of pressure change that occurs by moving internally from an E to an A while you are semi-occluded. And the pressure is not going to be very different at the source. So as Karin says, maybe puffy cheeks will help you to simulate what you're going to do later when the mouth is open, or more, focused kind of a shape. But as far as the benefit you get from it, it's pretty much the same either way.
So does that also relate over into style? No matter what style you're singing, would you pick an SOVT that is more related to the setup that you're wanting?
Yeah, the puffy cheek is more related to getting the energy into the 1000 hertz range, where a lot of the theater singers want to have the strength in the voice, around 1000 hertz. But the classical singers put more of the energy into 3000 hertz range, the singer's formant, or the ring in the voice. And I think by going to puffy versus more focused configuration, you do a little bit of that arrangement of the harmonics that you have in the voice. But again, it's probably not a whole lot difference in the effect that you actually get from that pressure.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, which goes back to, then we really want to focus on what is happening first in the pharynx. And we talk a lot in the book about the voicing carrier. we want to establish a really healthy voicing carrier. And then all of these adjustments that we're talking about here helps you get to what you want to do. Like if it's in the speaking voice, or if it's a more of a belt sound versus a more legit sound, that comes later. But establishing the carrier and the health of the carrier is primary. And then you can bring the other aspects into it. The one thing that I want to really emphasize is that sometimes when using a straw, I have patients that are like, well, if I do it this way, it's better. Or if I do it that way, it's better. Not necessarily. Let the straw do it for you, and then you can make adjustments. But if you're trying to make something happen with, like, say, a wider straw, you might as well just put the straw away, because then you're not letting the resistance change. Your positioning, you're trying to change it. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So you want to instruct to just put it in, allow it to be, and reap the benefits.
This is a very important point. We have studies going on right now where people want to use targeted versus untargeted SOVT use. And by targeted, and I always ask them, what is the targeted SOVT? Well, they say that's when you feel all the sensations in certain parts of your body. But those sensations aren't going to be the same on every pitch and every sound that you make. So you're targeting a sensation that may then not give you the full benefit because you're not feeling it anymore in some other. But the straw works all that out by itself. It gives you the benefit. I don't care whether you're at high pitch or low pitch or high intensity or low intensity.
Yeah.
So again, it's too much brain work is not helpful.
Yeah. And without making ourselves some enemies, we have some wonderful props that we can use. We've got the tubes here by Joshua Alamu from Mad About Voice. We have the cocktail straws, which are, I think, just a product of what we have Costa Coffee here in England. We've got like the belt mask where you can put it over your face. And Mindy Pack's got her SOVT cup. Orin Boda has the Risono straw with, I think, over 12 native resistant configurations. Are these tools necessary for us? Or
I love it. I think it's great that people are doing that. That's certainly, we don't want to put our thumb on any type of entrepreneurial and excitement about making this better and getting it out to the public, and to helping the public. The biggest thing that I have is that if you use a device, then try to find out what that resistance is. Try to find out what that pressure is that you have at the lips, or you have at this point where it goes out into the air. If you don't know the resistance, then you don't know where you are on that chart. And so you might be using a device that has less resistance than using a narrow straw in water. So it just informs you about, what is the science? Where are we trying to go? And then once you get there, what can you do to make this easier or help your body be reminded of that muscle memory and that learning that you used?
I think if it motivates people to do the exercises, I say use as many variations as you can. And if it's a wonderful piece to have in your pocket, or you want to talk to other people about it and demonstrate it, go for it. That's good. The thing I would be worrisome about is when clinicians or singing teachers start to say that this is better than another one, or they start to exclude somebody else's because it goes against their marketing strategy. That's where scientists have to come in and say, we're looking for what the change really is, and that's dependent on, as she says, the pressures that are created. How you create them, and what you want to add to it, that's fine.
Yeah, I think it's about, as you say, compliance, isn't it? I know these vocal tubes for my younger and maybe teen singers, knowing that Joshua Alamu, who's worked with Rita Ora and Little Mix and bands that are in their life and in their listening library on Spotify, like it makes them more compliant to the exercises because they want to be like their favorite pop star, so they can have a real benefit on that compliance element.
Wonderful.
Phew, we don't have any enemies then.
No.
As voice science progresses, what changes to singing teaching and clinical work are you seeing, and what direction do you think voice science is going in?
Right now, there's a huge amount of lack of understanding of rough and distorted sounds with multiple sound sources going at the same time. Everybody wants to know, how do you vibrate, the true false with the false folds, or the area epiglottic folds, or even the tongue against the back of the throat, and all these different techniques,
which produce really interesting, wonderful sounds, that we hear.
Yeah, and so, but with that new exploration with all these avant-garde sounds that we want to make, comes a problem that I'm facing, is because people immediately put a label or a word to something, and then we as scientists have to figure out, is that word scientific enough that we can put any kind of data to it? For example, I learned now from people in Denmark that they use terms like words like curbing and edge and overdrive and things like this, which may be okay, but then the scientific world has to figure out, what do you mean by overdrive? What do you mean by edge? And does it get you back to the spectrum? And do we have enough understanding of the acoustics behind it? So that's a challenge right now, is again making the science world and the performance world come together with terminology and understanding that they both feel comfortable with.
So imagine that we are at your kitchen table like we are now, and we're sharing a meal. Firstly, who's doing the cooking, and what are we having?
Well,
I'm not much of a cook. My husband cooks better than I do.
And I'm not much of a cook. My wife does most of the cooking.
So that's a good point. Like, we have really good support networks that help support us when we get in our heads.
Fine, I'll do the cooking. So what would be your go-to meal then, Ingo? What would we have for our dinner if it was left up to you?
Oh, I make my own things, and they're very vegetable and fruit oriented. And I'm a German, and so bread and cheese can never be left out. And dark chocolate has to be part of the daily diet. But enough. I do eliminate a lot of things that are not healthy. So
okay.
We're at the point where we just make our own meal as we go along during the day.
Yeah. Okay, well, so let's imagine that we are just tucking into a vegetable and fruit casserole sprinkled with some bread and cheese. Sounds delicious. Okay. What questions are we going to be batting back and forth about what's left to know about SOVTs?
Oh, specifically about SOVTs?
Or whatever might be on your mind.
You want to talk about self-organization or AI, or there's all kinds of things.
So many topics that are popular right now. Mm-hmm. But you mentioned self-organization. That is a beautiful theme for all of voice production and speech. We tend to believe that the brain controls everything in the body, that the flow of information through our system is always in the downward direction. But we're now finding out that there is self-organization even in the physical plant. When tissue moves and so forth, there are signals that are generated that go back up to the brains, and the brain then has to adjust itself to those conditions. So one of the beautiful things is that two-way street that exists between what the brain controls and what the body controls. And oftentimes, big motions with low frequencies are more controlled peripherally in the body, and fast things with small movement are controlled more in the brain. And this is all part of how the speech organizes itself, because we do rapid articulation, we do rapid pitch changes. And so where does the control end up and what dominates what? That's a big discussion that we've had in a meeting here last year. And now we're wanting to bring machine learning into that as well and see what do we need to learn with machine organization as well as what we can learn from doing experiments on humans.
And your book also includes quite a bit of reference to nature and how this has informed the work that we do as singers and with SOVTs, particularly looking at doves and frogs and alpacas and llamas. If we were to look at nature now, what animals would you like to reference in future about singing, or delve into a little bit more in that sort of link?
Good question.
Well, obviously, the ones that would give you the best information would be primates, but they are the most difficult to do experiments on now because we treat them with the same respect we treat humans nowadays. And so everybody goes to mice, but mice have the problem of being so small, but they have a genome that's well described. And so right now I can say I don't have a single species that would give us the best information, but a good colleague of mine at University of Arizona is looking at all species that are available, and you have to go across. You can get something from one, something from another, and something from another. And that's why then simulation is so useful, because with computer simulation, we can get data from one species and another, and see if we can find some common ground in between.
This is nothing to do with singing, but I would really like it if someone could do a study on the blue bottle fly and find out, if they have so many eyes, why can't they see the window that they have just flown in to get back out again? I've been chasing them in this heat wave that we've had. It's like, you have literally just flown through that massive gap in the wall. Why can't you see it? You have like 9 eyes or however many they have.
When you think about it, their lives really shouldn't have windows, right? If they were just in the forest, there wouldn't be any windows that they'd have to
do.
Yeah, I think there's a lot to be said for, like, I am fascinated just in how a speech is developed and voice is developed, even from a child to adult, and the wonderful concepts that we can use in therapy are based on how we developed in the first place and how we all organized to that. So
yeah, I found it really interesting in your book how you talked about the baby cry and how the cry is there for their survival, and how that is not a learned thing. It's just part of their motor organization. And the question of how we can maybe maintain a bit of that as we move into, I mean, our adults, we tell babies to shush because the noise is infuriating, and it's meant to be, because we want that to spur us on to make it stop and solve the baby's issue. But it would be interesting to know how we might be able to maintain some of that motor organization because I'm assuming that belt might be assisted by that, if we could keep some of it.
Well, belt comes out of a natural call. That's first how it was developed, call somebody at a distance, and that's from that we get the belt. And I wish that we could all have more opportunities to call and to scream a little bit and to shout and all those.
But culturally, it's not accepted sometimes, right? We tell our children to be quiet, and we also have technology. We've got microphones now where we don't need to call across long distances. So a lot of it has to do with what our culture and what we have developed that kind of restrict some of the things in speech, or don't maximize our capabilities over years of development. And so, yeah, we are always encouraging going to the extremes of a voice so that we can find, what we are capable of, so we don't lose it.
And then there's a new question that we're wrestling with is vocalization only for communication, or is it also for just general health?
Right.
When I see a flock of geese, and I used to be in the park in Iowa City a lot, and the Canadian geese came down, in the spring and the fall, and they were forever making these beautiful sounds. I mean, they were right next to each other, and they didn't have to do that calling all the time, but even in flight, they're calling. And so you ask yourself, is that part of just keeping all the anatomy, even the non-voice anatomy, in good shape? If you were stranded on an island and you had no human to talk to, would you still vocalize? And why?
Yeah, I'd probably vocalize more.
Because it helps with our emotional needs, and I believe even psychiatric needs, and how we connect with each other. I think it's as valuable. Yeah.
We can't let you go without talking about NCVS, and I'd love to know about the Summer Vocology Institute and how we might be able to get involved in that and everything that NCVS is doing.
Well, thanks for going in that direction. As I retire soon here from the university activities, I will keep very much involved in NCVS, and Karin has been a board member of NCVS. We want to have an organization that has first and foremost an interest in keeping the science alive, the physical science and biological science that goes behind sound making. And so that's how we've structured ourselves as an independent, we call it a 501c3 charity organization here. And we hold conferences once every other year, and then we support the Summer Vocology Institute here at the University of Utah. And we are now in our 20th year or something like that, or even more. I think in the year 2000, it was the first one in Denver at the time. So it's now 24 years that we have taught that. We get something like 30 to 40 students that we admit every summer, and they come from all countries and all states here in the United States.
It's such a joy to be a part of that, because you really see people connecting. A lot of people feel like, well, now I know where my tribe is. Now I know who to connect with, who thinks the way I do about voice. It's a wonderful thing to learn together, and to do hard things like some of the coursework can be challenging. I've been studying these concepts for 20 years, and I'm still finding, that's what that means, and connections and application. But it's so much more fun to do hard together.
They take 3 hours of lectures in the morning, and then in the afternoon they solve problems. We literally have them solve, paper pencil problems with all of units and whatever physics requires them to do. And they get together in groups of 2s and 3s and so forth. And I think the value is the long-term days where you try to assimilate and think through stuff. When we go to conferences, we're there for an hour for this lecture, an hour for this lecture, and then we fly home and it's over. We can't even think of it, because now all of a sudden we have to answer all the emails we got. But they're sitting for 6 weeks with a neighbor, and they don't do anything except just focus on this material. And that gives them the chance to really integrate it well into their brain. We think, anyway.
Yeah. And for people who want to get involved in that, do they just go to your website?
Yeah, they go either to the NCVS website, which leads them to the Utah Center for Vocology Insight, and there they can register and do all of the preliminaries to get there.
And I can
Excellent.
provide links if you
Yeah.
want both. Yeah.
Excellent, thank you. And is that also where they can get a copy of your wonderful book? Here it is.
Yeah.
Voices Free After SOVT. Do they just follow the same sort of link and find their copy there?
Yeah, it's
Yep.
on the website. If you just scroll down, you can get a link to it.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Well, Ingo Tietze and Karin Titze-Cox, it's been such a pleasure to be with you today, and it's been a real career highlight of mine. So thank you so much for your company.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
It was a wonderful conversation. You know how to make us feel at ease.
Yes.
Oh, I'll definitely keep that bit in. Hey you! If you're enjoying the Singing Teachers Talk podcast, then don't forget to hit the subscribe button. We are committed to bringing you engaging conversations and valuable insights from experts across the field of voice. By subscribing, it means we can continue to do that. You'll never miss an episode, and you'll be helping to spread the word to other singing teachers, vocal coaches, and overall voice nerds. So subscribe to this channel now and just watch your teaching grow.